is my great honor to moderate our first session this morning, which is going to be a candid conversation with two people who have both been mentors to me in this field. Kieth Whyte, who's the executive director of the National Council on Problem Gambling, over 25 years experience in the gaming and gambling world. He's spoken and presented in 43 states and 25 countries on this topic. So I think he can't retire until he hits those other 7 states that he hasn't been to yet, but a staunch advocate. And our own Carol O'Hare, executive director of the Nevada Council on Problem Gambling, for a little more time than that. She tells me that I think it was April Fool's Day on 1996. Yes. Moved into a position as the executive director of the Nevada Council on Problem Gambling, and it has been just as staunch an advocate here in the state of Nevada, testifying before the legislature and the Gaming Control Board, a number of different entities, and really building programs within the Nevada Council that now connect us to many, many partners across the community. And so it is my great honor, again, to be just a fly on the wall pretty much and ask some questions and see where they go. We'll leave some time at the end for all of you to ask questions that may arise as we have the conversation this morning. We'll see if the clicker works. Yeah, we've kind of covered that intro.
Well, actually, Ted, if you go back one second.
Oh, yes.
So hi, everyone. First, good morning. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. I pulled these pictures up. We kind of surprised Carol with this. These are both from the early 2000s. I think we look exactly the same today as we did then. But there is a lot of history, and so we're not just going to dwell on the past, obviously, because that's not. I mean, it's of interest to us who lived through it. But we do want to try and mine a few nuggets of things that we think will be interesting for you, not just now, but going forward. But yeah, this is, I went back in the days before digital photography and found, I know mine's from 2001. I think yours is maybe a little bit more recent.
Oh, I have some older ones than that, but we won't.
But as we start to think about this discussion, we realize that we've been doing this gambling thing for almost 60 years between us. And the field has changed a lot. And as Carol and I were talking months and months ago, we said, wouldn't it be great to have some of those conversations that we always have after the conference? But maybe we'll have this in person now, because I think what you're going to hear is we're both fairly unfiltered on a normal basis. And now, after 60 years of this, we're going to let it fly.
Right.
And Candid Conversations was a tag that Kieth came up with. The first thing we realized was all the conversations that we've had over these 30 plus years, we're still having them.
Yeah.
And I think that was, we were kind of in that founder's syndrome mode where we know that you guys don't want to, every time you see us, hear us tell you what it was like, when we were a kid. But we realized that the conversations don't really, the questions don't change.
Yeah.
Now the conversations do change because our environment changes, our culture changes. The entities out there that we interact with grow and change and morph. But overall, we're still asking the same questions. And in some cases, we're still not answering them.
That's right.
So,
yeah.
And so we thought it would be kind of interesting, and we're going to let Ted just pick our brains. But
yeah,
we thought it'd be kind of interesting to have this conversation in front of you, because we get on the phone for, to plan what time you're going to get to the airport. And then an hour and a half later, after we've talked through all this stuff, and I'm like, did anybody write that down?
Yeah.
So that's what we hope we can do for you today, is kind of walk ourselves through some of the stuff that we have found to be fascinating and sometimes challenging.
Yes.
About being the old timers in the room. So.
Fantastic. So one of the first questions I have, because both of you have taken a pathway through industry to get where you are today, which might strike some folks here as a little bit unusual, and maybe that presented some challenges for you early on. And I kind of gave a very 30,000-foot introduction of you both, but if you could both take a few minutes to talk about your journey getting to the positions that you hold today.
Well, I'm going to tell you, my journey started January 31st, 1991, when I entered GA and began my recovery. And I believe at that time or thereabouts, simultaneously, Kieth was starting his journey.
Yeah.
He's like the evil doer. So we'll let him explain that to you. But my journey was very odd because I did not come looking to be in this field. And I encourage everybody to listen carefully when I say that. I have over the years had people call me, I love the new sponsee, 17 days in GA. And I asked my sponsor, how can I get a job like you have?
Right.
I said, you do not want to get a job like I have the way that I got my job. But it is truly a journey that just came out of being in recovery. I figured out very early on in recovery that I had hid so much of myself in my addiction. The one thing I didn't want to do was have to hide in my recovery. And so I started having my first candid conversation with my husband, who was a gaming employee.
Yeah.
He's a prop dealer. And I'd never worked in the gaming industry. I'd always been on the front side of the machine. And I said, I just don't get it. I mean, don't they talk about this at all? He goes, well, not really. Well, I grew up in the Midwest, and I knew about Don't Drink and Drive because we had Anheuser-Busch right across the river from us. I didn't get it. And I said, how can we be in Las Vegas, Nevada, and nobody's talking about this? Because believe me, there were plenty of people showing up to a GA meeting. And so we started having that conversation with ourselves. And it just happened that he had worked at one of the Harris casinos back in Atlantic City. And he said, well, yeah, we did have like signs that said, bet with your head not over it. And there was a 1-800-GAMBLER phone number. And I'm like, whoa. I'd never gambled in a Harris casino in Las Vegas because it was on the Strip. I gambled in my neighborhood. So I knew nothing. And 3 years later, I became the first responsible, I said problem gambling consultant for Harris Casino, because I was invited one time to go tell them my story in what we called casino camp, where they were training managers. And I found my voice. It wasn't very polished back then. I'm not sure it is today. But for the first time, I got to talk about what was the biggest thing in my life, both what had affected me negatively and what was now changing my life positively. And I got to talk about it with people who were not in GA. And so my husband, God rest his soul, he helped me to propose a consulting contract, which I discovered in a closet last week. And we pitched an idea with the help of Dennis Conrad, who was really the genius behind it, and said, what if you had somebody who is actually in recovery to advise you about how you do this? Because you got to know how to talk about it. And that was my first gig. Yeah. And the only conditions were, you don't own my story, you don't tell me what to say, and if you ever have verifiable evidence that I have gambled, the contract is void and you owe me nothing. Yeah. And I will tell you, I know that sounds like, whoa. I was blessed that these were trustworthy people, and I learned as much in that role as I taught, probably learned more than I taught. And it was through that role then that I ended up finding out about the council. The rest is history. April Fool's Day. I still say every year, I keep thinking maybe one of these times I'm just going to say April Fool's.
Yeah, exactly.
And retire.
And Carol's being modest because this is probably the world's first problem gambling consultant for a casino company who was in recovery. A, and B, she's now mentored everyone in this room in one way or another, including me. So my origin story is a little bit different, but when I came to the American Gaming Association in 1995 from the American Bar Association, this is the first
Did you
time.
hear that? Lawyers and gaming. That's how.
Yeah, there's a right.
But it got better as he traveled.
There's a long story there too. Yeah, some might say I went from evil to more evil, but it was great because the AGA was just being founded then. Gambling hadn't really expanded outside Nevada in the early 90s, but it was clear that there was a need for a national trade association. I didn't know anything about gambling, so when I came, the first person they told me to call was Carol. And the second person they told me to call was Dean Hesterman, our friend at Harris, who's still there. And then I met people like Alan and so on and so forth. But those were heady days at the AGA in 1995 because the biggest issues then, and it's fascinating to look kind of back from this perch now, what we were talking about then was crime. If you build a casino in Davenport, Iowa, are somehow mobsters going to then, destroy the heartland? I mean, it was things like, will restaurants go out of business? It just, stuff that would just all these crazy myths but images that people had built up that now was kind of just this inflated, distorted picture of old Las Vegas and movies and things like that. But that was a real concern, that somehow the Hilton Hotels Corporation was mobbed up, and it was going to take over Biloxi or something. So problem gambling, quite frankly, was not the big issue that it was today. And the only real insight I've ever had in this last 25 years or so was that I thought it was going to be a bigger issue than it was then. And so that's when we started reaching out. That's when we started learning. And one of the slides we have later is a document we put together called the Responsible Gambling Resource Guide. Alan remembers it. A bunch of you may remember it. And this was 1997, 1998. And it was the first kind of compendium of industry responsible gambling policies. And we'll talk a little bit about the development of that, but Carol was on that initial committee, along with some good friends and colleagues, some of whom are still working in the industry today. But problem gambling became more and more of an issue. And the more we started to work on it, the more we saw that this was something that I did think was going to be the bigger or biggest public policy driver of the gambling debate. As expansion happened, as the industry grew, and as people understood more about this disorder. And they understood more about recovery, and they understood that it was so stigmatized and treated so much differently than people who had other diseases and disorders. And so that's kind of where we all came together. I came to the National Council in 1998. I just forgot to leave. And so, we're still here today. But yeah, it's been a great journey. But Carol's been a mentor. Carol's been a friend. Carol's been the world leader. It is just it's so great to be here, and it's so great to be on this stage with you today. And all that you've done, she's revolutionized the world of responsible gambling. It starts here.
And I want to point out too that this is the 15th annual Nevada State Conference, the first conference that was held in Nevada on problem gambling. Was the National Conference on Problem Gambling in 1998. And we had to find a non-gambling hotel to hold the conference in. And in fact, there was one back then. The name escapes me now. What was the non-gambling? Alexis Park.
Yes.
Lovely place, beautiful grounds, no gambling at all. And that was because I was 2 years in as the executive director of the Nevada Council, and I was talking with all the national people, because how do you learn to do this if you don't talk to others? And they said, well, it's time to pick a place for the conference, and how do you do that? Oh, you just apply. Well, that was fun, because there was a little bit of a rift on the committee and the board when they were deciding where to pick the location. So that was my entrance into the council. There was some stigma here too.
Yeah.
It's like, we can't go to a gaming. I'm like, really? Shouldn't you want to go to a place where there's gaming? Isn't that where gamblers are? And so that was our first sort of formal interaction. And I actually happen to know that they decided to hire Kieth in the hallway at that conference after they came to me and said, what about this Kieth Whyte guy? Should we trust him? And
the answer is no, by the way. They should not have.
But I knew from my interactions as I'd been with Harris over those couple of years that Kieth and Dean and several of the people, they legitimately wanted to learn. They were not trying to find a way to excuse it, explain it. They wanted to learn. And so I still am baffled that we are both still here doing what I guess maybe neither one of us remembered to leave.
Yeah.
So our first kind of big overarching question, what does the industry know about your gambling problem, and when did they know it? And because we've got so many new people here, I think it would be good to start out with this, maybe distinguishing responsible gambling from problem gambling. You often see these two terms conflated, especially within industry. You hear people talking about it. So kind of as a brief education, could one or both of you talk about what's the difference between responsible gambling and problem gambling? And also what's inherent in that term responsible? Whose responsibility is it?
Sure.
And why?
It's a simple question. You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we tried to frame these questions again provocatively. All right, but I do think jumping to the end at the start, I do think data is now the issue of this decade, if not millennia. And I think there's some fascinating stuff we'll talk about. But what it comes back to, Ted's question, who's responsible for responsible gambling? I think initially when we got in the field, it was all individual responsibility. Right, it was almost 100%. Employees were told to dummy up and deal. Most companies didn't have any sort of corporate social responsibility policy at all. You were responsible for your own problem. You were responsible for getting yourself help. You were responsible for your recovery. And I think, especially in the American context, that is still primarily true today. But now I would say, and I think Carol agrees, what we've fought for over the past quarter century is a more shared vision of responsibility. That responsible gambling is, of course, you are primarily responsible for gambling responsibly, but that responsible gambling now encompasses industry corporate social responsibility and government responsibility. If you're going to tax and legalize and regulate this, you bleepity bleep better have some of that money going back into programs and services. As we know now, we have in Nevada. We certainly didn't have that back in the 90s when we started. And so I think there's a much broader shared vision of responsibility. And the industry responsibility, again, has deepened and expanded over the years. We're doing a lot more now than we ever did back in the 90s. And that's fantastic. We've made enormous progress. But when you look at trends like ESG, environmental and social governance, when you look at publicly traded companies and how they are assessing their risk around gambling problems, that conversation continues to expand. So that would be that's my short answer on RG. And it's a term of art. And I think the other important thing I'll say, and as we think about our journey, it started here. Carol and I were amongst the many that were pushing RG to be a much more expansive vision. And now it's your turn, because it can never just be set in stone. There's never going to be one answer that's appropriate for every jurisdiction and every culture and every company and every state. It's going to have to continue to evolve and change and shift. So just because it was okay back then or something wasn't okay now doesn't mean that that's fixed and permanent. So that's the other thing I would leave you with, because sometimes we get stuck in these old models.
So the earliest explanation I could give for responsible gaming and problem gambling is if you can gamble without harm, then you're responsible. Mm-hmm. If you gamble and it causes harm, then you have a problem. And that was about as nuanced as we could be in the beginning. I was trying to wrap my brain around, terminology. Keep in mind, I stopped gambling in 1991. We were still calling ourselves compulsive gamblers, which wasn't even an accurate term. And we had pathological gambling, which was creepy because, the only time I'd ever heard the word pathological was pathological liar. And I'm sure I lied a bit, but, wow, invite me to get well and healthy and to talk with someone about my pathological problem. I didn't even want to talk to you about where I was on Tuesday night. So the industry's concept of this was they knew that sometimes, especially here in Vegas, they knew that sometimes people had problems when they gambled, but I don't think they had the whole picture. And so the stories I heard in the beginning what the industry did was when I was working the GA hotline, and a guy called and wanted to know where the GA meeting was, and so I was looking up something. He goes, "Okay, well, I need to tell the limo driver," and I'm like, "What?" Well, he was at a casino, and he was a high roller, and he had a host, and he had used up his credit line, and the weekend wasn't over, and they said, "Joe, I think maybe you ought to go check out some." And they sent him in a limo to a GA meeting at a Denny's on Sahara. So responsible gaming efforts existed, but they weren't organized. And then over the years, and you are going to hear this, and we're going to try to get you sensitive to this. You are going to hear a lot of terminology. First, it was responsible gaming.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And then it was, well, no, we'll call it responsible gambling. Well, no, because the industry is more than gambling. Well, now, then what some of our, now we're talking about.
Disordered gambling.
Well, then we got disordered gambling.
Sorry,
Yeah, and.
Safer play.
Safer gambling. And you know what? At the end of the day, this was where I intersected with this public message. I have to be able to answer that question quickly and simply for the person who knows nothing. And that is how the brochure When the Fun Stops came about.
Mm-hmm.
The easiest way for me to explain it from my lived experience and to somebody, and remember, I'm living with a guy who's on the other side of that table in a craps den. He's seen everything. And I said, you know what? The only way I can define it is when it stops being fun, it's a problem. And so that's where we've got data, and we've got, we've got people, science, and we got to figure out, is it harm reduction? Is it safer play? All those things. But the bottom line is some people can, some people can't. The more we understand that and we learn about it, the better we can address it. But the simple fact is, it is everyone's responsibility. It doesn't matter where you put that word. Yep. And that was the important message, I think, that I picked up quickly when I started to interact with the industry. Because if you try to spend your time figuring out which person, which department, which agency, which state is going to take care of this, you've got people showing up in GA meetings broke, busted, and disgusted and getting no help.
Yeah.
We have to be doing it simultaneously. So I believe that it is everyone's responsibility.
Yep.
No matter where you're at, what you do, there's a way that you can be a positive influence in this. Even if it's just you will leave this conference in 2 days with your head exploding, and you will go have coffee with your neighbor and go, wow, that was something.
And we talk a lot now.
And tell them one thing that you heard.
We talk a lot more about risk now. You know, it's not a binary state. You're not a responsible gambler and a problem, then just your problem gambler. There's a continuum. People go back and forth. There's a lot more. And When the Fun Stops is so great that the entire country of England stole it for their national awareness campaign. So if any of you have ever traveled to England, you'll see this huge industry campaign.
They modified.
When the fun stops, stop.
And which was the wrong message. The whole point was, when the fun stops, you need help to stop.
Yeah.
If I could just stop, I wouldn't have needed. Yeah.
So that was.
I was flattered.
Her influence is global. I
was flattered after I called the intellectual property attorney and said, could we maybe stop that?
So it's an interesting discussion about language. And language does matter, of course, right? Some of the language that has been used, the pathological gambling, one of the discussions about changing that to gambling disorder was about the stigmatizing nature of that label. And this is already a disorder that people report for help at a very low rate. We suspect, around 10% is all people who are suffering from gambling problems ultimately seek out help. And so changing language around some of that is important, and I think using person-centered language. I am a person in long-term recovery from a gambling disorder, as opposed to a compulsive gambler or disordered gambler. I mean, there are no other illnesses where we label people. I'm an addict. I know people self-identify, depending on where they are in their recovery process. But using language that doesn't label someone by their illness, I think is important. At least it's important to me. Yep. And I've seen, this responsible gaming is still, I think, in the U.S. the most common term that you hear industry refer to their programs by. I like responsible gambling better because I think gambling is something different from gaming. I'm going to be talking about gaming disorder a little bit tomorrow morning and how that is different. I think we should call it gambling, and I've heard that slowly happening. At least
It is.
People are starting to refer to it at least as gambling. So one of the things I was very aware of when I was out in my gambling universe is that I had my loyalty rewards card, and I knew there was tremendous amounts of data being collected because I got my monthly calendar from my location of choice that told me every day of the week that I could come in for the incentives, whether it's the free lemon meringue pie or a bottle of champagne or $25
The world's
in
most
free
expensive
play cash.
toaster,
Yes.
Exactly. And what a wonderful thing it would have been for me at the time to even have access to my own data and be able to see what I was spending over time, much less be encouraged to do that. So how if gaming companies are truly committed to responsible gambling, to this concept, why aren't more of them using these data to help develop programs, or are they starting to do that?
Well,
What are your thoughts?
Keith's going to bring you more to this century, but I'm going to tell you that one of the issues with data is we know we can collect it.
Right.
We know there's lots of it out there, but we don't know how to use it.
Yeah.
And data in the hands of someone who doesn't know what the data refers to can be dangerous. And we've had a few examples over the years of some missed shots at the responsible gaming program, because people who are really good at interpreting numbers and data but don't know anything about problem gambling are trying to interpret it through the lens of casino marketing or something else. And so the data isn't good or bad.
Yeah.
It's the problem with data is being able to figure out, collecting it is great, but being able to figure out who should be analyzing it and how should they be analyzing it. I also had one of those players' cards. And when my gambling started to get out of control, I stopped using it. Not so much because of the data collection, but because it identified me as being a frequent player when I would stick that thing in the machine. And I just didn't, plus I didn't want the toaster. Literally back then it was like going to Chuck E. Cheese. You got the points and then you went into the casino and you could get I do think I got an answering machine for my phone one time.
I saw one. I was in Ohio 2 weeks ago, and MGM, I think it was MGM, had this huge billboard. You could get a John Deere riding mower. I think it's a very Ohio thing, right? That's, but I'd never seen that before. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was just, I almost turned around on the highway and did I really see that billboard? Is that really Midwest? I don't know.
I do think data is important, and you're going to hear this as a theme throughout the 2 days. Everything is important.
Yeah.
And what matters is how do we use it, who's using it, and probably my greatest concern is that when we start building, if we build it, they will come. When you start building these machines and these mechanisms and these methodologies to get the data, are you using it for good? Are you using it to accomplish something? Not simply using it so you can have a bullet point in your annual responsible gaming report. And truly, this is where we get candid, and I get to be the old grandma who says whatever at the dinner table. And truly, do you want to know? Do you really want to know?
Yeah.
Because you got to want to know if you're going to look at it. And you may not like what that data tells you. And you need to be prepared for that. And that's all of us. That's not just the casino. Right. That's the clinicians. That's, we have our assumptions and we have our best practices as best we know them. But when the data starts to tell us things, we're going to have to listen to it and be prepared to maybe do some tough things that we didn't think we were going to have to do.
Yeah. So that goes back to that first slide. And again, we framed it very provocatively. What does the industry know about your gambling problem? When did they know it? That phrasing comes from the classic Watergate hearings. What did you know? When did you know it? Type thing. And I'm not a lawyer. We're not going to talk about liability, but I do think that is the central question. The more and more data we collect, In the thousands, if we have 1,000 points of data on your gambling behavior, and 10 of them may be predictive of a problem, we're never going to be able to assign that. We don't have robot psychiatrists, right? You're not going to be able to determine whether somebody has a gambling problem, no matter how much data you have.
Yeah.
You're going to talk about risk. You're going to talk about warning flags and red lights. And at some point, you're also going to talk about what is the industry's responsibility when they hold all this data and when they do see that there's all these increasing signs of a potential problem. Are they still targeting you with marketing? Are you still accessing credit? Are you still, what are we learning about your payments? Anyways, there's a whole lot of stuff that clusters together. It's not perfect, and it will never be perfect. It can't be perfect. We have so many different ways and reasons to gamble and things we do. What's predictive for me might not be predictive for Carol. All that changes, but it is to say it's a conversation that we need to continue to have, because they're the seeds that I would say we have to flip the way we think about the data. It's going to help us learn more about normative gambling behavior, right? Not abnormal gambling behavior.
Right.
And so that's going to be powerful. And then we'll use those thousands of factors to determine, our gambling may deviate from the means. But the industry has an enormous role to play. There is liability there. So I didn't say I'm not going to talk about liability specifically, but I will say at a certain point, if you know that I'm playing many, many, many times beyond my annual income, that I'm on the floor 24/7 for the last month, that I'm constantly getting NSF from my credit cards and my debit cards and everything else. As we move to a single customer view, and you're going to be able to see through that payments data through my bank account that I'm doing the same thing at the casino next door and at your competitor and your online and your social casino place. All that's going to build up, and at some point, someone's going to say, you really ought to not continue to send them offer after offer after offer. So anyways, we don't know where that point is.
And perhaps you should even let them know, hey, this is what your spending has been with us over the last 10 years. And in the last few months, this is something
it's moving from passive to active. And I think that's the other great transformation that we'll see with data. You're collecting all this information, but traditionally it's always been Ted's responsibility to pull his CTR, to go to the cage and get your transaction. And that's only for that property or that company. You don't have a single customer view. The industry increasingly will. And it's how we then get that information back to you in a way that can be non-judgmental, non-stigmatizing, but helpful to you. It's all these subtle behavioral nudges. And there's so much we don't know about this, but using that data to nudge you in a direction that makes you a safer, sustainable, longer-term customer is going to be the art.
And I agree with that, but I'm also going to be a little bit impertinent with this and say, so how many of you have ever taken what we call TAM card training? Responsible service of alcohol. Put the hands up. Come on. Own it.
Okay. Oh, I have, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. And how many of you have ever been in an establishment that serves alcohol and somebody is really having too much fun with their alcohol and maybe the bartender is pulling the glass back? Yeah. Well, some of that is because of dram shop laws.
Right.
Some of that's because somebody walks out. By the way, they're not doing that because they're concerned about alcoholism. They're doing that because they're concerned about you driving into me while you're drunk and killing me and my dog. So we have some sort of skewed view of what we do in this country. But I do think that one of the questions that is going to challenge us going forward, in the beginning when people would ask me, because I was the only one that they could ask, because I was the only one out there publicly saying this, well, when should the casino cut them off?
Yeah.
Now, my answer back then was always, they can't smell the roll of quarters on my breath. They can't, it was a roll of quarters. They can't, they can't know, first do no harm. You see somebody playing at a machine and they're angry and they're banging on the machine and they're crying. And if you're going to come in there like, Captain Save a Gambler, try to whisk them away to safety, you may get sued. Their dog may have died this morning and they're just upset and you don't have enough information. So we've been training that message for a very long time. But be careful what you pray for, Because at some point, you got to accept the fact that the day may come when you have to say, part of our policy is there are players we don't want, we don't need, and we will not allow them back.
Yeah. Even if they're going to go to your competitors.
Yeah.
And so, because that's
exactly because
that's been the rub.
What we have is,
we would do that, but
we have self-exclusion. So if I say I shouldn't be here, that's okay. But you know what? The bolder move is to say, sometimes we just have to cut them off. And it does happen.
For sure.
Believe me, it does happen. But it's not ingrained in the mindset of the operator. And there's a point where you have to say, there's plenty more fish in the sea. And at some point, you got to really join the process here.
And this is coming to, it's so in the UK, you're required. You have, there was an affirmative requirement by the Gambling Commission there that any data you collect must also be used for responsible gambling. A number of our regulators are looking at that. It's certainly a message the National Council is preaching. We're going to push for that in regulation and statute. So, I think everyone's going to, even the loyalty data that you hold now. Caesars has how many millions, tens of millions of loyalty card, that at some point, we're going to increasingly talk about how you're using that data. And then the optimistic, so the negative, the difficult point is that's a tough conversation, right? You may well find there's a lot of evidence of harm, and it might not just be 2%. That number might be a lot higher. The positive point is some of the light leaders and the folks that are most likely to be here at this conference from the industry are the ones in the US that are pushing the hardest on that. So, Caesars, we know, is looking at it. MGM's looking at it. Sightline and the vendors are looking at that. So there's progress being made, but as advocates, we want to applaud the people that are at the top, right? Cream of the crop, that's great. But we have to hold the industry to the lowest common denominator. And friends, that is a very, very low denominator. And it's not just state by state. That is lowest common denominator nationwide across every vertical. So just think what the worst US lottery is doing in terms of responsible gambling. That's where we have to say the floor is. And until they raise that up, until the worst, the most egregious vendor out there, that's where we have to hold that standard. So
this would be a lovely time to interject a thank you to all of our industry
sponsors. Yeah.
And since I did my little hand raising, because I've called you out for being old attendees, new attendees, about alcohol. Could I get a show of hands from people who currently or have worked in the gaming industry?
Yeah. Thank you for being here.
See? Now, some of you worked in the gaming industry and you've moved into this industry. Some of you are still working in the gaming industry, but that's the point.
Yeah.
You ask who's responsible? We're all responsible. It's a human issue.
Well, and the ones that are screwing up are the ones that aren't here. You look around and you see your competitors and your peers that aren't here, and that's where the leakage is. That's where the risk is. It's.
So we're going to move on to the next topic, but you brought up advocacy, and I think this is a great transition to have some of these questions about some of the personalities and key influencers and influences, and certainly we have two of the most influential right here on stage. But when you both came into this area, advocacy on responsible gambling, advocacy even on problem gambling awareness was kind of a new thing. And so let's see, so what has made us such great advocates? Are we great advocates on one of the most stigmatized issues in America? How did you start that process when you first came in? Because we had no responsible gambling regulations or standards anywhere in the country. Nevada was a leader in that area. How did you go about reaching out to both, industry, legislature? Talk a little bit about that.
I'm gonna say the process began because I showed my face and introduced myself. There was this.
Silence your cell phones.
Thank you. That was the announcement I failed to make this morning. You're forgiven, Ted. I think advocacy starts, and I have shared this even in my recovery circles in our little GA conventions, because people come in and they find help, they find hope, they start to get their life on track, and they want to make a difference.
Yeah.
And this is the simplest way I can tell you. It starts at home. It starts with you. It starts with you just saying one thing about this that somebody hasn't heard. And my advocacy was not a scripted, planned thing. I just showed up. Somebody said, will you come tell your story to a bunch of people who don't know anything? I said, I guess I can. I do it practically every day in a GA meeting. Then advocacy grows out of your interactions. So if I had started telling my story and everybody went, oh yeah, I totally get that. And I'm like, okay, well, what am I advocating for? Advocacy starts when you're listening to what isn't happening.
Yeah.
And you can find something to say about it. And in 1993 and 4, that was not a big ask because there was a lot that wasn't being said. Now I think it gets more complicated. You can't advocate for everything. That's why I have Kieth up here, because we start talking cashless gaming and internet gaming and sports betting, he's going to talk about it because I don't have the bandwidth for all of that. Everybody has to find the thing that you can advocate for. It's all important, but advocacy starts with relationships. That's my belief.
Yep.
You can't advocate for something with somebody who does not want to engage with you, who does not want to listen to you. It's kind of the rule of sales. Qualify your customer. I sold computers for a living before I gambled, which is crazy because I gambled on video poker machines. I should have known better. But you need to qualify your customer. Because if you're talking and you're sharing and you're advocating, you need to put that somewhere where it might take hold. If you're just, and this was my first public speaking, was at a national conference when I took on the role with Harris, and they sponsored the luncheon at the national conference. And we had a little panel of industry people and recovery people and me, because I kind of didn't fit, quite in the pegs. And I had someone from the back, after I told my story, I had someone from the back of the room who was with a council on compulsive gambling. And I'm explaining what I'm doing with Harris, and I'm going to help them do their part. And he stood up and he goes, isn't that a little like sleeping with the enemy? And I went, wow, what did I get myself into? But the fact is, that was the perception. And so at that moment, I think that's what sealed my advocacy attitude, was I said, you know what? I can drive in a few minutes from my house down to the busiest intersection and probably the most gambling that takes place in any one spot in this country. And I could stand on the corner of Las Vegas Boulevard and Tropicana and hold up a sign that says, down with the casinos, help problem gamblers. I said, I will do nothing with that. I will help no one with that. I was given an amazing opportunity to go in the doors of the casino. They invited me in for the conversation. Now, that's not going to happen for everybody, but that's the point. And Ted has a lot of experience now with what we do in the community. As soon as, and there's some of you here that I am sure are here because you had one conversation with Ted. And then that led to, well, maybe, how many of you have had Ted do a presentation somewhere where you're at? And you've seen a presentation that, and it's growing. Because if you have an open door to have the conversation, then it happens. And that conversation is always only the beginning of it, because you're going to have more conversations. And then that person, it's a little bit of the 2x2 thing. I know it's art. We gather the animals together and make sure that we get enough of them to make a difference.
And I would say, Carol talked a lot about the stigma around pathological gambling. I would say that the only asset I bring to advocacy is that I'm a pathological optimist. In that I constantly, no matter how many times you get told no, we're still there. I mean, to have had the same job for 25 years is pretty ridiculous. But I do think things get better, And so one of the things that we both had was a willingness to not just complain, but to do.
Yeah.
And if you didn't like, you didn't like something or you saw an opportunity, we had that conversation. And we were polite but persistent. And I think the other thing that advocacy that Carol and I always shared, and we would talk about this after every single conference, because people would complain and they'd moan and this is bad. And operators were complaining about, the council's complaining about operators. We all complained about state government, But let's do something about it. And we had a broader vision, and that's evolved and changed over the years, that every single person in America deserves access to comprehensive problem gambling prevention, education, treatment, enforcement, responsible gambling research services. Full stop.
It wasn't much. We didn't ask for
That,
a
and
lot.
that seemed crazy. I mean,
Yeah.
that was beyond the pale. When we started, the majority of states had no public funding for problem gambling services. No company had a director of responsible gambling. Most companies didn't acknowledge it at all. It was just, the whole thing was completely barren. But we were audacious enough to say, if that's the end state, we can either just complain that it's not going to happen. We could, you could be anti-gambling. And if I thought being anti-gambling would have achieved any of that, maybe I would be. But I don't, and it hasn't, and it doesn't.
And we'd witnessed that attempt. That approach had failed miserably. Anyway, we had bold ideas, and Kieth and I are not joined at the hip. We have butted heads a lot.
Oh, gosh.
And I was on the board of the National Council. And
And
there
Ted
were,
is now. So
yes, and Ted is now. And there were times when, gosh, I mean, yes, you are obsessively passionate, and he would get in front of that board. If you've ever had to deal with a board of directors, you bring all your passion in the room, and sometimes they're snoring, and you're going, wow, come on, guys. Kieth would bring all that passion into the boardroom, and he would make these outlandish statements. Well, I just see a time when, we're going to have the NFL running advertisements at Super Bowl. And we went, what?
Yeah.
Guess what?
That's,
It happened. It took 20 some years.
yeah.
And we had this idea that, we need to know that any person who needs treatment for problem gambling can get it. And I said, that's what I want to see. Someday I want to know that the person who has nothing,
Yeah.
they cannot buy milk for their children, will be told it's okay, you can go to treatment, and we will not tell you that you have to have it covered by your insurance because the state will pay for it. And I don't know, is Kim Garcia in the room?
Yeah, she's here. I know, it's her. Yeah,
Wave?
there she is. Yeah.
Wave, Kim?
Yeah.
Kim Garcia, who manages the state's problem gambling prevention and treatment fund, and Jeff Murata, who keeps us on track with all the things we're doing. We saw it happen, and there were people that thought I was loony.
Yeah.
I said, well, it's Nevada. Why are we not paying to help these people? And Kieth wanted the NFL, and son of a gun.
Well, and soon
It eventually
Coca-Cola.
happened.
Soon, NFL gets us out. So the circle right now is mainly gambling industry still, because they're the most, they've got the most responsibility, right? NFL broadens that a little bit. They are a stakeholder clearly, and that's why they, we've had a long relationship with them, but now they're our largest donor. No longer gambling companies are our largest donor at the national level, it's the NFL. And from NFL, we're then gonna try and leverage all the rest of their sponsors. And then so on and so on, because broad social change only happens when it's a national public health issue, right? Smoking, breast cancer, gay marriage, any issue you looked at that the United States have ever had a massive public change in, it's not been because it's just the people that were most directly affected, it's because we realized that everyone has a responsibility for responsible gambling. Everyone has a responsibility for problem gambling as a public health issue.
Well, by the way, everyone is affected, and that's
Yes.
another part of the
No
advocacy issue, because we go out in the community, we put up our little table and our little brochures and our little sign, and health fair events, and people are all excited. They're getting little freebies, and they're learning about diabetes, and they're walking along and looking, and they go, ooh.
Yeah, not gambling.
I'm not going to walk past that table. Oh, that's not my problem. I'm like, great, I'm so glad to know it's not a problem. Do you know anybody who gambles and you have any concern about them?
Yeah.
And then you have to take it out even further. When I gambled and I did the most harm and had the most financial difficulty, how do you think my 3 children were surviving?
Right.
Food pantry, the lost and found at church where I could get maybe a couple of used jackets for them. My friends and neighbors and family who I was telling them about my car breakdown to get an excuse to borrow money from them. We are all impacted by this like we are all impacted by any other mental health issue that affects our community and by any other health issue. So we have to stop thinking about the silo of us and them and you and they. It's all of us. And I don't want to be advocating for something that is solely going to help the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, 5-foot-tall person who only lives on the east side of town. Why? They might move to the west side. And now what do we do about them?
Well, and here's a provocative statement. I think in some ways having a director of responsible gambling has now hampered us. Because there are companies now with tens of thousands of employees where there's one person, and they do all responsible gambling. That's it. And okay, I've checked the box. I have.
Good to see you, Caroline.
Yeah. And Caesars is not one of them, by the way. But and you would say to this company, well, what's your plan? Well, we've got a director of responsible gambling. Well, do they have a budget? No. Is it in their KPIs? No. Is there outcomes? No. Do they train all their employees? No. So one employee does not make a responsible gambling program. And it's good, it's a good start, but if that's where it stops, you've still got a whole huge problem. And unfortunately, there are a number of companies where that has stopped. There's still a lot of, believe it or not, there's still a lot of companies that still don't train their employees. It's surreal, but that's the standard.
I think a lot of Carol's comments highlight how deep the stigma still is around this illness in particular. And I put a slide up that Kieth provided us with in some of the survey data, and we see we still have a lot of work to do in the general public in terms of attitudes about what a gambling problem is, what the reasons are that someone one has one. But I think we've
Check 1, 2, 3. Is that good? We have certainly normalized gambling as a behavior across the United States. We're currently experiencing the largest expansion of legalized gambling in this nation's history, the legalization of sports wagering. I think, at the same time, we really need to normalize the discussion about what problem gambling is. I think that's 1, 2.
Yeah.
So at the same time, we need to normalize the discussion, of course, around what problem gambling is. That this is a real thing. It's potentially deadly for some people, but that there is help available, and that help is very successful for people who will engage in it.
Yep.
But getting people, through that door and into the awareness. I mean, I never imagined I'd be watching the Super Bowl and seeing multiple responsible gambling ads. Some pretty edgy and some very family friendly. I don't know how many of you saw the Manning family talking about the issue of responsible gambling during the Super Bowl. It was very
Thank you, Caesars.
kindly and sweetly delivered and very, very serious. I mean, it's wonderful.
Yeah. So there's enormous opportunity, but these numbers are all changeable. If you go back and you look at every other public health issue or societal issue in the United States, we used to have far negative attitudes about almost lots of things. That has all changed. But it has to be a deliberate choice, but we're making that deliberate choice. The one thing that the National Council will try and do to help everyone at the state level is we're going to continue to measure this public opinion. We now have funding from NFL to do our first national public service announcement. So that's going to go on the air in the third quarter of this year. There's a lot more discussion around this normalization bit. I think we can move these numbers. I think we can flip these numbers. I don't know if it's going to take another 25 years. I hope not. Maybe it's 5, maybe it's less. But we want to see the vast majority of Americans who believe treatment works, the vast majority of Americans who know where to go for help, and the vast majority of Americans who would seek help if they had a problem. The other thing we wanted to say, just some of our heroes, this is Don Hewlin and Rena Nora, who many of you know, of course, and Judge Moss is here. Longtime friend of the council and in the field. But they're two advocates that taught us a lot. Don Hewlin, I'll speak about, and then you can talk about Rena a little bit. Don's rule was this. Whenever you're faced with a tough decision, in the problem gambling field, do what's best for the problem gambler. That's the Hewlin rule. That's the rule he taught me when he, Carol, and Eddie Looney took me to sit in my first GA meeting. That was like 90 years of recovery, just the three of them, and this new kid, 1996, didn't know anything about anything.
In Las Vegas, by the way.
In Las Vegas. But the Hewlin rule is something that we all should be thinking about, at least if you're working in and for a council. That's the guiding star that I've lived by, and that's helped us make a lot of tough decisions. What's best for the problem gambler, broadly defined. But
yeah, and I think that we tend to get into the detail and the weeds and the complexities and the policies and the regulations, and the bottom line is first do no harm, and always remember who it is that we're trying to help.
Yep.
Because you sometimes have to just simplify it, you know? Rena Nora was an amazing lady. How many of you in the room ever had a chance to meet her, hear her, see her on a video? Yeah, raise your hand, Cheryl. be born from her. You know, Dr. Nora was the most humble person I've ever met, and yet she was one of the biggest entities I've ever known. And she could say the most profound things. She was a psychiatrist. She was at the VA here in Las Vegas. She started the first certification board in New Jersey for problem gambling. She taught clinicians how to treat people. She went to GA meetings to learn how to do that. And the most important thing that she always said was, no matter what you're doing, what your advocacy is, what your role is, if you're going to change public policy, if you're going to change regulation, if you're going to treat a problem gambler, remember the problem gamblers are people first. Mm-hmm. We start getting caught up in this labeling, in this
data,
this
names,
ism, they're people. They're not a disease. They have one. But they are people first. If we can keep that planted in our brain, that everything that we do is eventually going to affect a person, it might help us to not get so far out there in data land. And that's the core of it. By the way, Don Hewlin, Arizona guy,
oh man,
crotchety old guy.
Yes.
He was an enigma. I remember the first time I got in the car with Don Hewlin. Jerry Bauerkemper's going to come in the room to hear this. Yeah. First time I got in the car with Don Hewlin, he was in Arizona. He was the head of the Arizona Council, guy in long-term recovery. And the first time I got in the car with him, there was 7 cartons of cigarettes in the back seat of the car. And when he talked, he was like cowboy. Yeah. Rah. And I've been in Vegas and trying to learn how to talk to these polished, industry people. I'm like, okay, I can do this. I'm a good old girl, right? But then I discovered that his skill and his art was he talked about it. And he talked about it from where he was. And he talked about it with his voice. So that is one of the important messages too, is you use your voice. Don't try to have somebody else's voice. I will never be Rena Nora. I will never be Denise Quirk, and I sure as heck will never be Keith Whyte. But, well, and I'm not.
That's right.
That's probably good to know. But it's finding your own voice and what works for you, and sometimes you have to find. Somebody was that? You have to find a way to bring it back to earth, because we have to work in the micro and the macro, and that's the way our lives all work now. And it's important to remember that, they are human, they are people, and if we treat everyone as people, including our peers and our colleagues, you are not a competitor of mine. And I know you research types, you are sharing a space where everybody will do something valuable. There doesn't need to be competition for being the best or the worst. Right. There just needs to be participation in doing it.
Yep.
So full disclosure,
Whoa, may the 4th be with you.
So full disclosure, I am one of those research types. They'll still let me up on this stage. About half the time I'm a research scientist in the other part of my life, and I understand the value of data, and we often talk about the importance of using evidence-based programs, but in this field for a long time there wasn't any evidence, right? People had to develop something, start collecting the information, see what worked, see what didn't. So I'd like to kind of finish up this conversation talking about vision. How big of an issue is problem gambling? And getting back to some of the things that were mentioned earlier, we talked about Nevada being an innovator in the getting legislative regulation in place around responsible gambling practices and problem gambling. And at the time, that was the gold standard, right? Because there was nothing else. Today, if you were to compare Nevada's gambling regulations to some other states, you would see we are certainly not the gold standard in that area anymore. However, we have lots of people in industry, the Caesars, the MGMs, until recently the Las Vegas Sands, who went way above and beyond what our state regulations are in terms of training of their employees, the potential to proactively engage clients even on the floor who were heard making distressing comments in some case. So my question to you to kind of finish this up, we want to allow some time for you to ask questions too, is where are we going with all of this? We with cashless wagering, we have the ability to potentially protect both industry and clients to a degree that we haven't ever in the past, and engage them. Where are we going? What's happening?
I think that what we have to remember is that in 1998, when Nevada passed the regulation 5.170 programs to address problem gambling, wow, that was a mouthful. And there were some industry folks who were like, huh? And there's still some industry folks who don't know that's in the book. But when that was passed, it was groundbreaking. It was earth-shattering. It was not on CNN that night. But it was groundbreaking because it was the first ever gaming regulation in the United States that even addressed problem gambling. And it was a wonderful regulation for those days, with buildings that had walls you could put a sign on. It was a great regulation when everybody, sat in a room and got their employees trained. The world has changed, and that regulation hasn't. Now that's not because they're resisting. It's because we've kind of been really busy. We haven't had a lot of time to, and everything's moved so fast. So I will say this: where we're going is we're still trying to figure out how to get all the planets to line up. So in some states, you've got great regulation. You might have terrible legislation. Maybe there's no money. In other states, you have a gold standard industry program, but maybe there's no mandates for it to actually be used. And here we have a regulation that was the gold standard and it was adopted in many states who said, we need a regulation, so let's borrow Nevada's, and then we changed it. But I think we have to stop looking for a gold standard.
Yeah.
I know, sorry if anybody out there
People love it.
is
They love the
startled
term.
now.
Gets used and abused.
Because what does gold standard mean? Well, first of all, what do you think of when you say gold? Oh, it's the prize. It's the best. We give out gold medals at the Olympics. This is not a competitive issue.
Right.
We need a good standard.
Yes.
That would be nice.
Yes.
We need a standard that is responsible.
Right.
We need a standard that achieves the goals that we've set. But saying gold standard is like, well, then what? Who has a silver standard?
Yeah. Well, and here's
And
something.
how do you achieve gold if you're only silver? It just doesn't make sense anymore.
As we've been saying up here, I think, consumer-centric, right? A good standard would be a consumer-centric approach to responsible gambling and problem gambling that is not based on a particular company, a particular vertical, or a particular jurisdiction. A person-centric good standard would be that you get the same type and level of responsible gambling no matter where you are in the United States. Right now, your chances, I would say, of recovery, and this is a life and death thing, your chances of getting treatment, getting to recovery, and frankly, saving your life matter. The biggest variable is probably what state you happen to pay taxes in. Because here in Nevada now, you've got a lot better shot than you would in Utah, because Utah does absolutely nothing. And that is unacceptable. That is, and it should be unacceptable. Your chances of survival should not vary based on your geography, but that is the standard that we have today. That's the kind of thing we need to push back. A good consumer-centric standard would be one national number that works everywhere. So you don't have to figure out which of the 27 state helpline numbers to call to get the life-saving help you need right now. No. We should have the same minimum age across the country and across the verticals.
Calm down, everybody. Calm down.
I know, this is crazy.
This is crazy
talk,
stuff, but
Yeah, can you imagine an era in which you had different ages for beer versus vodka, vodka versus gin, Booths versus Gordons? That's where we are with gambling. The fact that no one's ever harmonized that stuff, because that's a tough discussion. So we're doing good, responsible gambling. We like it, but these are the candid conversations, frankly, that we all need to be having more and more. It's either a national public health issue or it's not. Right?
Sure.
That's the place we are today. And they're hard, difficult stuff. Yeah. But come on, we can't figure out a minimum age. And it's imperfect.
And yet we could pay a lot of money
arbitrary.
Personally to get on a rocket and take it. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
There's some kind of imbalance in how we value our time.
117 billion in revenue last year on the legal side alone. 85% of Americans have gambled in the past year, and we can't tell them what the minimum age is. How can we do prevention and education if we tell kids the minimum age is 21 except when it's 18, but sometimes it's 16, and social casino it's not at all?
Yeah, there you go.
That is not a prevention message, folks. It's so anyway. I mean, these are the
questions.
We want to get to your questions as well.
Yeah, so can you hear the passion up here?
Yeah, so now we've scared you into
And it
silence.
exists not only up here, but within industry. This passion exists among people who are in the responsible gambling realm, within academia. Yeah. All of these organizations are working together to solve some of these problems. I love what Carol had to say about, not identifying a gold standard, but a good standard.
Yes.
Because there's not a one-size-fits-all approach across all properties, across all types of gambling. And for those of you that are research geeks, I'll plug the Journal of Gambling Studies. There was an interesting study that looked at responsible gambling program across several MGM properties, and depending on the location, whether it was rural, whether more of a community-based as opposed to a strip-based, for example, where you've got a fairly short-term transient client base, the effect of those programs was very different, and there were opportunities for improvement across the board, right? So we want to give you the chance, though, based on what you've heard, to use this last 10 minutes to ask your questions. I guess
just shout them out, stand up, and
we have
we got a mic.
Testing.
All right.
Hello. Hey, everybody. Nope. There we go.
All right. So maybe over here first, and I think he's got a mic coming. That's cool.
I don't understand the incentive of the casinos to cooperate other than shame. Is there something I've overlooked?
Yes.
Can you repeat that question?
So the question is, what's the incentive for the casinos to do good, responsible gambling other than shame? There's been a lot of work on this, but I think, the industry folks can answer this probably better than I. But it's about sustainability. It's about people that are problem gamblers are not good long-term customers. There's the social license to operate, and at some point, if the industry is seen to be abusive, that license can go away. Never forget, it's a regulated industry. And then there's all sorts of bits about the fact that you want to work in a company that actually cares about its customers. So basic good customer service means caring for your customers and hoping that they come back. And I think what you'll see eventually, and then I'll turn it over to Carol, is right now the rest of the country is being bombarded with ads around sports betting, right? It's all about offers, bonuses, how much can we pay you to set up an account? If we advertised gambling like we did cars, we'd be talking about safety features, reliability, things like that. And I think that's that subtle transition. When I buy my Honda, it's because it's got anti-lock brakes, it's got warning systems, it's got all this other stuff. I am not the only car buyer. There's lots of other people that may have better reasons, but that's one of the reasons I chose to buy my car, because it was the safest. We're advertising gambling right now. Who can be the riskiest? And so, but I do think there's companies that are going to figure that out, and they're going to start to market to consumers to be the most responsible, to be the most sustainable, and those are companies that are going to be market leaders. They're going to have better share prices. They're going to get a license to operate in jurisdictions that have much stronger regulations, especially as we go internationally. So there are 1,000 good reasons to do responsible gambling, but the bottom line is it works. The companies that do it do well, and I think that's the proof in the pudding. Because that's where those are the companies that are sustainable. Those are the folks that are in the long-term business.
In all my years of doing this, I have not met a single gaming operator that was feeling shameful.
Yeah.
Shame is not the motivator.
Yeah, that goes back to the anti-gambling thing.
Because first of all, when you say the word shame, that goes back to my concern that when I first got into recovery, that was the standard of consideration for somebody with a gambling problem. You should be ashamed of yourself. And when I got into recovery, I had a great deal of shame and grief and loss. Shame does not motivate anybody to do something good. And frankly, I've never met a company that can collectively be shameful about it. I believe that what really is, and I'm going to rephrase your question. I think there is a motivator out of concern for the people who are being affected, but it shouldn't be shame.
Yeah.
It should be concern. It should be responsibility.
Good customer service.
It should be good customer service. And yes, if you are letting people come in the casino and they're getting attacked in your parking garage and you're, feeding them poison food and you say, I don't care, well, then you should be ashamed of yourself.
Yeah.
But there's not an intention to hurt us. It's a byproduct of the industry. It's a consequence of the product they sell. I know people who would die if they were given a peanut on an airplane. Should they be ashamed?
Yeah.
No, they didn't take the peanuts off the plane out of shame. Liability, maybe a little concern because it's disruptive to the flight when people drop dead on the plane. But shame is not a motivator.
Right.
And it's important to me personally that, and I thank you for asking the question because
100%.
see, we're having a conversation and that
Yeah.
was bold for you to ask that. Because that is one of the misconceptions, is they should all just be ashamed of themselves. I will say, honestly, my husband's recently deceased and he spent 30 years in the gaming industry. It served us well. He had a good income, he had good benefits, he had good friends, he had a good career. As many people do in this state, as most people do in this state. Just like there are many people who are able to gamble as recreation, they're able to do it responsibly, and they don't suffer harm. Yeah. So let's not throw the baby out with the bath, but realize that we need to identify the motivators for companies to do this, and there are plenty of them, and we as advocates need to be willing to lay out that buffet and say, what will work for you?
Yeah.
What's the thing that would motivate you to get engaged with us and do something with problem gambling? And you know what? If it's because they think the bottom line will improve, if they look more accountable, then good on you.
That's right. And the other thing to say, too, is that doesn't mean that everyone in the gambling industry is virtuous, nor should they be. And there are certainly a lot of issues. There are companies that do a terrible job of responsible gambling. But that is to say that the theory is true, and that the motivator is true, and that the companies that do well do better. And I think that the market doesn't solve all problems, but the market sends very strong signals that by and large, responsible gambling is the right way to go. Doesn't mean everybody does it. There's some short-term profiteers out there that are terrible. But I think that there's also some leaders that have shown the way. So yeah, we had a question, Aaron, over there.
Yeah, we're going to try this again.
There you
Sorry,
go.
everybody. We'll get these mics figured out.
Hi, good morning.
Hello.
I'm a home health medical social worker, and I'm not sure if I have the appropriate question, but I worked throughout the pandemic and saw a number of patients that no longer had access to gambling, no longer had access to food. It was their socialization. So I'm wondering, have you found data in regards to the impact that has occurred and had more people called the Gambling Anonymous? Maybe didn't realize they were had an issue with gambling because saw a lot of depression out there.
Sure.
I think we're going to, and you're going to hear a lot about that. I think Ted's going to we'll probably talk about that at some point in his presentation. What we saw during COVID and during the shutdown is both extremes. Mm-hmm. There are people who, because their opportunity to socialize in the restaurants, in the at gathering places, who didn't have problems, suddenly have problems. They're depressed, they're anxious, and some of them may have found online gambling. We are only just now scratching the surface of understanding what this has done to us as a community and as a society. You working in that field is one of the most important sources of data that we have. And that's why we're so aggressive in our attempts to raise awareness, to provide prevention, to provide education, because we know there are more people that are going to come through these hallways and pathways, and they're going to look different than I looked 30 years ago, than somebody 10 years ago. And we've got, and for people where that was their socialization, it may be affecting them in other ways. You know, they may be sitting at home drinking now because I don't have anybody to talk to. For problem gamblers, it went both ways, I think is a fair statement. Some people, it got worse because they couldn't get to the casino and they, you know, were doing other things online or otherwise. For some, it might have been the wake-up call. Mm-hmm. And they will say, you know, when I just could not go because they weren't open, it forced me to see what my life was. Now, that doesn't mean they woke up in the morning and, you know, sang hallelujah and they were cured, but it certainly made them aware that something was different. So we will be analyzing and gathering and analyzing and trying to understand that data for years to come.
Yep.
We've gotten the end sign.
Yeah.
I think we're out of time.
Yes.
I want to get you to you've got a 15-minute break, but please join me in thanking both people.